Hi, I'm Jen Dixon, American and British multidisciplinary artist and educator in the UK. I create all sorts of things, from humorous to deep and personal, in abstract and figurative styles. It's a pretty mixed bag, but it makes me happy and keeps me plenty busy. For this class, we'll focus on special effects in watercolour. Together we will identify amazing textures from the world around us, practice intentionally with those examples in mind to produce watercolour special effects you can really use, learn to apply these special effects to real painting work without it looking gimmicky, awkward, or out of place. It's going to take your watercolour art to a whole new level of fun and visual excitement. Let's dive into the materials you'll need. I'll be using cold-pressed watercolour paper because that paper texture is an important part of the effects you'll see. I'm not using expensive stuff, but more like mid-range. This is because you will get good results, but won't feel like you're going broke with experimenting. I like De La Rowney's Aquafine blocks and pads for this, but you can use any of the big names. Like, I know Canson makes some great mid-range paper too. Aim for over 200 GSM in weight. Ideally, more like 300 GSM. For paints, again, mid-range is fine for this, and I recommend your paints are from a reputable or traditional art supply company. The reason for this is predictability with the paint behavior. I'm using De La Rowney for this, but any of the traditional brands are a reliable place to start. Steer clear of hobby paints or kids' paints, as they will not behave well for this class. There are also lots of great small batch handmade watercolors out there, but their behaviors might be a little bit more difficult to predict, so just keep that in mind if you want to use them. For brushes, I like a couple of sizes in common shapes, typically round brushes and a couple of big ones for wetting large areas. Use what you have and make notes for brushes you want to add to your wish list. Household items used are paper towels, washi tape or masking tape, water in jars, table salt, cling film, and a pencil and eraser are always handy to have near. Gather these things up, make a tasty beverage, and let's get started. The world is full of amazing texture, and using a few special effects in your watercolor painting is a great way to introduce it into your work. This class isn't about photorealism. You don't need to mimic a texture exactly for it to enhance the visual effect. You're just adding a little razzle-dazzle and dimension to an otherwise flatter area of color. Take a look around you. Here's a list of just some of the things I can think of that can be explored with special effects textures. Rust, sand, stone, tree bark, moss, water, leaves, grasses, fabric, leather, metal, snow, skin, fur, feathers, glass, scales, bone. For this class, we're focusing on nature and how to use salt and cling film to achieve more visual interest in our watercolor work. It's going to be loose and fun. Here are a few photos of mine to inspire you, and I'm betting you have a few inspiring shots on your phones or cameras too. Learning to use special effects in your art means doing some tests first to thoroughly explore results before committing to your final artwork. I label and keep my test sheets for reference whenever I need them. We'll start with cling film. This is the stuff you find in your kitchen, or you can save it and reuse it from packaging. I reuse mine as much as possible by giving it a rinse and hanging it to dry wherever I find space. Sometimes it still has a little pigment stain, but I don't mind that for practice. Cling film can give some really cool wrinkles and folds in watercolor. So let's explore that by dividing our paper with some tape. I'm using some already used MT branded washi tape. I just sort of rinse off the paint that is left over and use it again. But first, why and where might you use these folds and wrinkles? Off the top of my head, woods, grassy areas, tree bark, water, but no doubt there are other creative uses as well. Your paint mix will need enough pigment in it to settle into both the paper texture and travel along the folds of the cling film. This one takes the longest to dry because the surface of the cling won't let air through. For this reason, I do not pre-wet the paper, but rather I'm applying the paint, then cling film really quickly after before the paint soaks into the paper too much. I just don't want to make it oversaturated, if you know what I mean. I'm using colors that I might use for water or rock pools in these tests. The colors I'm mixing up are pretty basic, using ultramarine blue, Payne's gray, a little dirty yellow made from color that's contaminated cadmium yellow and yellow ochre with some other bits and pieces in it, and a little muddy purpley red from contaminated alizarin crimson. I would probably be a little more neutral and subtle for the final artwork, but this should give us a good idea of the effects. Work quickly, and don't worry about covering the whole box if you don't want to. I'm leaving some white areas intentionally. The cling film I'm applying to the boxes are all used pieces that are a little bit stained, but that doesn't bother me. Each of the boxes is similar in color and strength of paint, but I want you to try several styles of cling film application on your paper. So I'm trying kind of a smoothish one first, a wrinkled one second, and directional wrinkles to achieve different and interesting patterns and lines. Get that paint down quickly to encourage the cling film to guide that paint before it soaks into the paper. A pair of tweezers can help you move it around with a little more precision. The way you apply your paint is up to you, but try to vaguely emulate the colors and placement of them as if you were working on the final piece. So if you're thinking about water, use colors appropriate for that river, rock pool, or sea. You can also do this effect in glazed layers to build a deeper effect. Here are some examples I made at another time. It's all about experimenting and testing right now, so be playful with it. Cling film special effects need time to dry, so be prepared to set it aside and work on something else for a while. Okay, these are dry and ready for their reveal. I could have peeled the cling film up after about an hour, but it's the next day because I got busy with other stuff. Just look how gorgeous these water-inspired special effects are. These are now a perfect base layer for additional glazing or detail work, maybe using some gouache over top, or mixed media like colored pencils or pastels. Each has a slightly different feel to it, so I will now make a note on the paper for how I created each of them and file it away for future reference. Working with salt is one of my all-time favorite special effects, and salt, though somewhat unpredictable in its results, is something you can manipulate with time and types of application to achieve very different results. Here's an example I made before this class to show what I mean. I've applied generous watercolor to these two areas and then immediately sprinkled on a bunch of salt. In the next two areas, I applied similar paint but let them dry for about 2 minutes before adding salt to the still damp surface. You can see the subtle difference in the effect due to how much active water was still on the surface. In these next two areas, I used salt water instead of granules. Using a pipette, I dropped salt water into my painted areas for a more subtle disturbance. And in these two final areas, I wet the paper first with salt water and then applied paint after, for the most gentle effect of all. Let's do a few of these together. Divide your paper up with some washi tape or masking tape. I've created 8 boxes. We're only going to do 3 examples together, but I encourage you to use the rest of the boxes for more tests and play. So this first box will do the wet application. Pigments react to salt differently, but these tests will also help you to identify which ones really strut their stuff. This first box is just like the examples I showed you. We're adding several colors and then sprinkling on salt immediately. I tried to do it in a patchy way to leave untouched paint as well. This next one is the same technique for the paint, but we'll let it sit for 2 minutes before sprinkling on the salt. Don't worry, I'm not going to make you sit here for 2 minutes. I am going to just jump to that part, but you'll want to maybe pause and wait for 2 minutes. This will allow more of the paint wetness to soak into the paper instead of sitting on the surface. And finally, we'll mix up a little salt water in a dish and drop it into the wet paint instead of sprinkling dry crystals over it. I keep meaning to try this with real sea salt water from my local beach, but I always forget. One day I will, though. After the page is totally dry, you can scratch off any remaining salt crystals. It's a brilliant special effect that can be used either in a heavy-handed way or a gentle way, and you can experiment with coarser salt and sea salt for even more results. We've done our research and our testing, so now let's look at how to apply and use these special texture effects without them looking gimmicky or out of place. Whether you want to paint figurative or abstract, you'll need to consider how dramatic you want the effect, and also embrace possible unexpected results. It's a very good go-with-the-flow kind of process. Here's a real project I'm working on, a seascape focusing on a rock pool and the geology around it. I took this photo from my local beach, which is designated an area of outstanding natural beauty and also scientific interest for the rock formations. It is endlessly interesting to draw and paint, and so this piece is starting on half a large sheet of cotton watercolor paper and will take many hours to complete. I start by sketching it loosely with watercolor pencils that will melt into the painting as I go. I'm not concerned with being exact in my drawing, but it's more of an arrangement of the elements in a way that pleases me and gives me wiggle room for the painting process. Let's look at the reference photo. I can see lots of potential for texture special effects in this one. The rocks, the water, the bubbles, the seaweed, all perfect for experimenting and play. After a light sketch, I start with a blue sky wash using cerulean and ultramarine. I won't have any texture up there, so it's easy to just bash that part out first. You could, if you wanted to, use masking fluid to create some veins in the rocks, but I don't mind using a little gouache if I want to afterwards for some of the lighter colours, so I'm just going to go for it with the greys. After painting an area, I quickly grab some cling film and apply it before the paint soaks into the paper too much. Remember that you can use these effects in layers of glazed paint, so if you want to start with a more solid wash of paint first, let that dry, then do the cling technique with a second layer of paint, then you can do that instead. There are no rules, and these are perfect things for you to experiment with on your practice paper for reference. After I get the base areas covered for a layer of cling film stone, then I dig into the rock pool water, bubbles, and seaweed. I'm dotting in color in vaguely the right places before I start sprinkling in some pinches of table salt. All of this will need to dry, but you can see from my practice examples next to the reference photo how they can be used in the work. Okay, some time has passed and it's reveal time for this stage of the work. I'm loving the way the rocks have turned out and the salted areas are looking very promising too. I wish I could show you the whole painting finished here, but this painting will probably take me upwards of 10 hours to complete, so you'll have to see the results on social media. The most important thing to take away from this is that the process is fun, easy, and like all things with watercolor, tend to look a bit messy and unruly, even ugly, before they come into focus through additional work. If you want to keep things simple while you get used to introducing these special effects, I recommend little still life subjects like this simple peach I did for a hashtag prompt thing I do with some friends on Instagram. Peaches are fairly smooth in real life, but a little cling film and salt have jazzed up the surface of this one to create a more interesting effect. I painted the peaches first and then painted a teal wash behind them and put cling film over that. I love how the cling film has made this halo burst over the slice. I couldn't have planned that better myself, and the other facets of the background give subtle interest and harmonize with the peach subject. Practice and play, then put that work into your art. It's such a fun way to spend an afternoon. And if you'd like to try that rock pool painting yourself, screenshot this photo now and tag me if you post your version of the painting online. Thank you for joining me today for this summer workshop retreat. I know you're going to have an amazing time continuing to explore these texture special effects and finding creative ways to seamlessly add them to your work. Like any new skill you learn, you're going to need to keep practicing and tweaking the way you do things until it feels authentically you in your work. I hope you'll tag me online in your journey so I can see your amazing practice and projects. You can find me on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter at Jen Dixon Arts, and my website, jendixon.com. I'm also a top teacher on Skillshare, where I have lots of classes on a number of art topics, so of course I'd love to see you there too. And a huge thank you to Peggy and the team at the Pigeon Letters for bringing us together today. Thank you for learning with me. Have a great day.